to talk about Reconstruction following the Civil War and examine how the 7 themes of AP US history apply here. Obviously, I've broken it down into 6 topics that we will explore more in detail later on. The first topic we're going to talk about today is the leadership in the Reconstruction era. So, obviously, politics and power is the main theme that is found within this, because Congress and the President greatly disagreed on how to approach Reconstruction most of the time. First off, you have President Abraham Lincoln, who is a moderate Republican. He really pushed for the 10% plan because then states would only have to pass the 13th Amendment and 10% of their voting population would take a loyalty oath to the Union and they'd be automatically re-entered into the Union. This means that the country would get back to normal as quickly and swiftly as possible. However, Congress proposed the Wade-Davis bill, and this bill had much stricter requirements for states to be readmitted. Lincoln, however, vetoed this and continued to push moderate Reconstruction. However, in April of 1865, he was assassinated, which really was the worst thing that could have ever happened for the South, because immediately following that, radical Reconstruction took hold. Next up, following Lincoln, you have President Andrew Johnson. He was originally from Tennessee and disagreed with Congress much of the time as he tried to impose limited Reconstruction, nearly the opposite of what Congress wanted. So at this time, in 1866, the congressional elections had made it a 3-to-1 majority for radical Republicans, giving Andrew Johnson minimal power in controlling how Reconstruction was going to happen. However, with his limited presidential powers, he pardoned many ex-Confederate leaders and also allowed the development of black codes in the South. Both of these actions really hindered Reconstruction, along with his inability to get along with Congress. Next up, we have President Grant. Yes, that's the same Grant as the famous general for the Union during the Civil War. And so Grant supported radical Reconstruction, but really wanted to focus on reconciling sectional tension. He allowed the passage of the 15th Amendment immediately following his rise to the presidency, and he was the last president to be really in charge of Reconstruction. Because then Hayes was elected in 1877, and his election basically marks the end of Reconstruction. We'll talk more about him later on. Now let's talk about radical Reconstruction. The first thing that applies here is politics and power. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 declared all formerly enslaved people citizens of the United States. Andrew Johnson vetoed this bill originally, however, Congress overrode his veto with a 2/3 majority and it became an act. Next up, the Reconstruction Act of 1867 split up the South into 5 military districts that had Union troops there to keep the peace and enforce the new laws that were coming through Congress. Additionally, Union generals were heads of each district and in charge of enforcing laws there. They also set up requirements to re-enter the Union. Between 1868 and 1871, all the formerly Confederate states re-entered the Union. All they had to do was pass the 14th Amendment, give the right to vote to freedmen, and deny it to formerly Confederate leaders. Next is the 15th Amendment, which gave black males the right to vote. This was very controversial because, number one, white females, had been asking for the right to vote for a very long time. This really upset them. However, it propelled the feminist movement. Next, you have Southern whites who really feared this. They felt that their political power was being infringed on by simply expanding the right to vote. And this led to a lot of retaliation that we'll talk about later. Next is work exchange and technology. With the 13th Amendment, it outlawed slavery. However, it did allow for a form of slavery to be preserved in the criminal justice system where as punishment for criminals. And this really is where the roots of the common problems in the mass incarceration system today are. The 13th Amendment obviously freed all the slaves, and then this meant that the South's free labor was gone. They now had to pay them. However, the slaves had no training of any sort except for working in the field, so this led to the development of sharecropping, where it was a very similar society to slavery. We'll get more into that later. Next is the Freedmen's Bureau, which is a federal program that gave economic assurance and also just helped educate African Americans and integrate them into this new society. We'll talk more about how that impacted African Americans in a little bit. Next is the identity piece of all this. The 14th and 13th Amendments said that African Americans should no longer be slaves, they are citizens, and they have the same rights as whites under the law. Obviously, as we know from history, the Equal Protection Clause really didn't hold up until the Brown v. Board case in 1950s and 60s. However, this was a significant identity change. They go from being slaves to citizens of the United States with rights and political power very quickly. Also, I'd like to note during Radical Reconstruction, there was Republican government in the South, and this caused a lot of contention between blacks, northern whites, Republicans, and also southern whites. We'll get more into that next time. Now let's talk about more specifics about Republican governments that were installed in the South. So, of course, politics and power applies here. There were Republican governments that were headed by Northern Republicans that were in the South. So these Southerners did not align with the political views of the people in charge. Additionally, there was the military districts, which also had a lot of control and reinforced the Republican governments in the South. This was not local governments. Instead, these were set up by the federal government to be installed in the South in hopes of advancing the South and reunifying the country. Next, there was the black vote. So Republicans who were going to be elected either Congress or as president really tried to get the black vote in the South and grab that Republican vote, because to many African Americans, the Republican Party was seen as a party who freed them from slavery. Next, there were Southern scalawags that were greatly looked down upon by other Southerners because they were Southerners who supported the Republican Party. As part of work exchange and technology, the war had really destroyed much of the Southern economy. The factories and cities that they had were largely destroyed, so they wanted to rebuild and industrialize the South in hopes of really getting their economy up to date. Lastly, there's peopling. Northern carpetbaggers came down and tried to buy land, buy businesses, and make a profit off of the war. Now let's talk about the Southern resistance to Reconstruction. These former slaves coming out of slavery and now citizens of the United States, they are very illiterate and poor due to the system of slavery that they were previously in. So in order to restrict the black vote, many whites in the South installed poll taxes, in which many African Americans could not pay, and also literacy tests which they could not read for the most part. This greatly restricted the right to vote for them. Also, there were terror tactics in which violent groups terrorized African Americans into doing what the whites wanted so the whites would remain in power. Additionally, there were black codes which were very, very similar to the codes of slavery, in which blacks could not be seen in certain places in public without having their white employer there. Oh wow, it sounds very similar to blacks couldn't be certain places in public without having their slave master present. And then there was a new culture in the South because of the new rights that African Americans had gained. There was the rise of the KKK, which targeted African Americans with violence in order to keep their political control, and really they were very oppressive towards African Americans. There was a group of redeemers who wanted to restore the old South, the slavery South, the Confederate South, and who greatly opposed Reconstruction. All these things hindered the effectiveness of Reconstruction as a whole. Finally, we have reached the end of Reconstruction. So, again, politics and power is really what's going to apply here. It's the presidential election that determines the end of Reconstruction. So, in 1877, there's a very, very, very close election between the Democratic candidate Tilden and Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes. So, Congress was supposed to decide this, and Congress decided to make a committee to decide this. This committee deliberated for many days, and there were many secret meetings with Democrats and Republicans surrounding this committee, and eventually they decided, through the Compromise of 1877, as historians call it, to allow Hayes to win, even though Tilden had the popular vote. In return, local governments would be returned to the South, also known as Southern Democratic governments would be there instead of Republican governments, and Reconstruction is going to end with that. The first thing Hayes does as president is to draw the troops out of the South. These are the Union troops that have been stabilizing the South, ensuring that the laws are followed. And this, basically, once they're drawn out, whites rise to power again, Southern Democratic Party rises to power, gains more popularity, the voting rights of African Americans are severely restricted. There are no longer going to be African Americans holding public office for nearly a century. And so another more economic reason for the end of Reconstruction is that during Grant's presidency there was a brief depression. And so Reconstruction really, it took a lot of money. You're industrializing the South. You're helping integrate African Americans into a new society. You're doing all these things that cost money. People and the government were tired of just pouring money into this project. And so they draw out, Reconstruction ends, and the rest is history. Now let's talk about how Reconstruction actually changed the lives of African Americans. So first, again, let's go back to the identity crisis. They went from being slaves to American citizens. The 15th Amendment gave black males political power in the sense that they could vote. This greatly impacted the political landscape of the South. Then in the work exchange and technology portion, that was largely driven by the environment. You have to think the South has been devastated. The land needs to be worked on. However, these former slaves, they don't have land, they don't have money, so they are still largely dependent on the formerly slave owners in order to employ them. And so sharecropping is the solution to keep the Southern economy going, to keep agriculture a major part of the Southern economy. This is where African Americans would work and live on the land of former slave owners. They would get a share of the harvest, they would sell, and the rest would be sold and profit for the owner. Also, they could only buy things from like the company store, and so that kept them in constant debt. The problem with this is that it very closely resembles slavery, and you could not get out of it. It was a never-ending cycle of debt and working the land. Next, you have what did aid African Americans in this time is the Freedmen's Bureau. They trained teachers, they set up public schools for African American children, which really helped propel the next generation, as people before them, they were mostly illiterate due to the lack of education within the slavery system. Additionally, they gave economic help to African Americans through small paychecks or helping them with labor disputes. Additionally, that really just helped them gain skills they needed in this new society. Last, let's talk about culture. Culture in the South, there were black codes, there was racism. African Americans were largely still very oppressed. This would last up until the 1960s, where they would really push for their rights and be able to exercise their rights more fully. Then the rise of black communities. Because there were all these terror tactics, blacks usually developed communities with other blacks. And then a synthesis for this would be how black culture really started to develop as they moved north as well, with the Harlem Renaissance and that sort of thing, which would unite them. So in total, was Reconstruction a success or a failure? Most people call it a failure, as the Old South did not really advance much. After the troops pulled out, it still remained the Old South. African Americans were largely disadvantaged. Also, the South's economy was not nearly as industrialized as the North. This caused problems that remain to this day. Thank you for watching.